doesn't give me enough of data and information. And zeolite has many applications, some of which I'm not even going to discuss here, like it's been shown to reduce the symptoms in reflux disease, as well as improve the pathological structure of the stomach, also with anti-inflammatory toxicity to the stomach. It's been shown to reduce symptoms and improve the effect on the stomach lining. It also has been shown useful in diarrhea and acute and chronic forms, and probably can be used similar to charcoal for that purpose. And one special property, which I often recommend, and you can find out about in my free masterclass, How to Avoid the Emergency Department, on my website, andrewkaufmanmd.com. I discuss the hemostatic properties of zeolite, that it can reduce and stop bleeding for bleeding emergencies, and it is a very integral part of any first aid kit, instead of using some of the synthetic toxic chemicals used in standard medical practice for those purposes. So today I want to focus on some of the more significant toxins related to various health issues, and how zeolite can bind those and remove them from your body. So I'm going to put some slides up now, and some of these are just a review articles that go through other studies, and there are also some clinical studies in here that I'll review. So this review article, which examines the literature, I'll read this quote from one section of the paper of interest. And it's all of these studies, by the way, are using slightly different forms of zeolite. But let me actually, before I go into the slides, I wanted to cover this because there are different preparations of zeolite that are available for purchase. So one thing is that it should be certainly food grade zeolite, which has been purified of any possible heavy metal contamination from the natural source. And I think you'll find that all the products that are marketed for human consumption or animal consumption will be of this stature, but you should be able to request a heavy metal testing report just to make sure. And of course, it will have aluminum, as it is supposed to, like I mentioned earlier. And what is further done to most of these preparations is that they are pulverized or micronized into a form that is generally in the micrometer scale of particles. And this is been shown to be effective at increasing the surface area and the binding capability of these substances. And generally it's available in a powder form, which could be encapsulated or could just be a raw powder that you mix in water as a suspension and take it that way. It also can be mixed with food, as it's done in livestock as a food additive to improve health outcomes, which I will talk about also. But there are also these liquid forms which contained nano-sized particles of zeolite. And I just want to caution you about those products because, one, many of them are quite expensive. Two, there is the total amount of zeolite in those preparations is very small compared to the dosages that are used in the clinical studies. So you may not be getting enough of it in that form. And then thirdly, there are some claims that the zeolite is absorbed into the blood when you use those liquid sprays or drops. But this has not been confirmed by any clinical evidence. And in fact, I'm going to present some indirect clinical evidence to you today that if you take the powder orally, that actually the zeolite does get absorbed as well. So without that evidence, there's certainly no advantage, and I couldn't find any studies where they used those nano-sized liquid preparations. So I would caution you to stick with what has been demonstrated effective in the research. So here is, as I stated, a review article, and I just want to read the highlighted portion because this gives some general information about the application. So it's PMAZC is the form of zeolite used uh, or described in this article. And it says it's prescribed for absorbing / chelating and removing harmful and toxic substances from the gastrointestinal tract. Now, that part about the gastrointestinal tract is not exactly proven, but that's what most of the papers say, and I'll explain why it may not be the case shortly. But it lists the different substances that have been shown in research to be bound or chelated by zeolite, and these include the heavy metals, nitrosamines, ammonia, and that is certainly an important industrial aspect. Mycotoxins, which include aflatoxin, which is a mold toxin that's found in peanuts, pistachios, and corn, and has been shown to be very toxic to the liver, for example. Cations, which most toxic metals are, that's a positive charged form. Radioactive materials and pesticides, reducing their absorption in the body, and that clinical studies show that it strengthens the intestinal wall and can function as an antioxidant by capturing free radicals as well. So there are several potential mechanisms by which it's useful, and a lot of different substances it can absorb. Now, this is another article which shows some industrial uses. And in the top paragraph, the highlighted portion, that it's used to extract cesium and strontium from nuclear wastes. So the fact that it can bind strontium especially may be relevant with something I'll mention a little bit later. And in the bottom paragraph, it speaks to the toxicity, which is quite important. And I'll read the quote: "When ingested, powdered zeolites, like almost all silicates, are inert and therefore do not react chemically with food or body fluids or their metabolites. The risk of any associated adverse effects is therefore insignificant." So that's somewhat theoretical, but in toxicology studies involving mice and rats, the administration of zeolite, clinotolite during a period between 6 and 12 months caused no changes that could be considered a toxic effective treatment. So no signs at all of toxicity with up to a year of taking zeolite. And there are other studies confirming that as well. Here is one more review article that I'll read a quote from the results. "In zootechnology and veterinary medicine, zeolite improves the pet's fitness, removes radioactive elements, aflatoxins, and poisons. Zeolite displays also antioxidant, whitening, hemostatic, and anti-diarrheic properties projected in human care." So there's some level of evidence for all those claims. And zeolite is routinely used in livestock feed for these health benefits. Now, here is a paper, and this is from the American Chemical Society, looking at removing substances from water for water treatment, like wastewater treatment, because we have discussed before that pharmaceuticals, like even birth control pills, antibiotics, antipsychotics, and other sleep medicines, blood pressure medicines, antidepressants, have all been found in wastewater from human sewage. And so this is looking at how can we use zeolite to take pharmaceuticals, personal care products, and also PFAS, the forever chemicals that are non-stick and waterproof surfaces used in a lot of cooking materials, furniture, textiles, and even clothing. And here what they concluded is treatment with zeolite resulted in a 72% average mass reduction of PFAS. So it can bind PFASs and also effectively removed pharmaceuticals and personal care products. So this is very promising for humans who may be contaminated with those very chemicals which are implicated in a lot of chronic health conditions. Now, it's also been looked at in animal studies of cancer as an adjuvant or additive treatment. And what the authors of this study determined is clinoptilolite treatment of mice and dogs suffering from a variety of tumor types led to improvement in the overall health status, prolongation of lifespan, and decrease in tumor size. And I think prolongation of lifespan is the most significant by far. Interestingly, local application of clinoptilolite to skin cancers of dogs effectively reduced tumor formation and growth. In addition, toxicology studies on mice and rats demonstrated that the treatment does not have any negative effects. So very, very safe. And here we see a good effect in a variety of animal cancers. So I've covered some of the benefits and studies, and I want to go into heavy metals a bit because this is perhaps the main application of zeolite as a clinically useful material. So this slide shows just some of the sources of heavy metal exposure and the impacts on human health. And you can see it sort of mentions here the alchemical elements of water, air, and earth, and lists some sources such as a variety of agricultural contaminants, as well as mining, coal power, and gasoline pollution, for example, with lead. Also in food, which can be contaminated, including fish, vegetables, rice with arsenic, and many others. We see cosmetics, industrial products like electronics, pigments, cadmium in tobacco smoke, wood preservatives, dental amalgams, and other sources. And it lists impacts on human health. It's implicated in cancer, dermatitis, muscle impairments, reproductive system issues. And we have found evidence of heavy metals and abnormal sperm morphology and motility, for example, lactation issues, gastrointestinal, lung, and kidney issues, immune and nervous system dysfunction. But some things are missed because it's also implicated in cardiovascular disease and neurodegenerative and neurodevelopmental disorders. And of course, this slide doesn't mention some additional sources such as vaccines. It does mention cosmetics, but not specifically deodorants. And it doesn't mention geoengineering, which I'll describe briefly on the next slide, because this is from the government agency, the National Institute for Occupational Safety and Health, NIOSH. And they did a study of the cloud seeding flares manufactured by the company MK Ballistic Systems in California, because there was a concern of occupational exposure from the workers at this company. And these cloud seeding flares obviously are used to alter the weather. And if you go into a search engine and just put cloud seeding companies as your search term, you'll see many of these firms come up in addition to MK Ballistic Systems. And it describes from NIOSH's study that what the ingredients are in these flares, and they include a pyrotechnic mixture of metal powders and oxidizers containing silver iodide, strontium nitrate, potassium perchlorate, aluminum powder, and magnesium powder, and many times they're combined with a polyester resin. So these things are potentially in the air and one source of metals, and strontium, as we know, can be bound by zeolite and is used that way for industrial applications. So we do get some protection there. Now, this is a study looking at anemia caused by cadmium exposure. And they gave the groups different combinations of things. So this is a little bit confusing, but essentially the three bars on the left are basically just the control animals. The animals just given zeolite and just given a second form of zeolite. They used two different forms of zeolite. And you could see that looking at the hematocrit and the hemoglobin, which are the two groups of or clusters of bars here, that in those three groups, they had normal levels in the blood. The fourth bar represents the animals just given the poisonous cadmium. And then the fifth and the sixth bar represent cadmium plus one or the other form of zeolite. And you can see that the cadmium itself caused quite a substantial anemia. They had a drop of about 30% in their hematocrit and hemoglobin. And then this was substantially mitigated by the zeolite. So we see that this is an actual clinical outcome that's objective, that they were far less anemic. In fact, they were right almost at the normal range of hemoglobin when poisoned with cadmium and given zeolite to mitigate that. So that's quite a substantial clinical effect. Now, here is a study looking at lead, and it was a similar design that they had a control group that they just gave lead to, and then they had groups that they gave lead plus zeolite. Now, here's an interesting thing about this study is that they gave the zeolite with the food, but they gave the lead with the water. So they didn't take the zeolite and the lead at the same time, because there could be an interpretation of some of these studies, like the cadmium study where they were both given in the food, where it could be said that the zeolite simply absorbs it from the food and it never gets absorbed into the body. It just comes out in the feces. But this study shows that that's not the case. Now, let me just read this highlighted portion, because this is the overall finding, that the dietary inclusion of zeolite reduced lead concentrations in the exposed and supplemented mice by 84%, 89%, 91%, 77, and 88% in the carcass, liver, kidneys, bones, and feces, respectively. And the bones is most significant with lead because most lead gets stored in the bones. So this slide actually shows the concentration in the bones over time. And the top curve with the solid dots represents the group that just got lead. And the bottom line represents lead plus zeolite. And you can see that the concentration in the bones is much, much lower, 77% lower compared to not zeolite. And these two graphs from the same study, the left one shows the lead concentrations in the carcass, liver, and kidneys. The solid dots and triangles are just lead exposed, and the hollow circles and squares are lead plus zeolite. And you could see that they're way lower in all those body parts. But this graph on the right is the interesting one, because it shows the lead concentrations in the feces. So if the zeolite was just absorbing all the lead from the water in the gut and it never went into the body, then you would see all of that lead come out in the feces. But here we see that the lead concentration is much lower in the feces. Now, why is this? The authors didn't actually address this issue because they applied a mathematical model that didn't really account for this finding. So I did a little bit extra investigation to see what's going on. And what I found out is that there's another study showing that the heavy metals come out in the urine. So this is called clinical evidence supporting the use of an activated clinoptilolite suspension as an agent to increase urinary excretion of toxic heavy metals. And this was a human study, and they didn't purposely give them any poisonous heavy metals like in the previous lead study, but they tested people and they had to have a high, or according to their threshold, level in the urine of at least 3 toxic metals to be included. And then what they did is they gave some of them zeolite and some of them no zeolite, but gave them a placebo solution so that they were blinded, and then monitored how much of those heavy metals come out in the urine. And I'll read the quote here. In conclusion, the study demonstrates that the daily use of an activated clinoptilolite solution represents a potentially safe and effective way to remove toxic heavy metals from the body through increased urinary excretion without removing clinically detrimental amounts of vital electrolytes. And this is key, that they looked at all the levels of electrolytes in the blood and the urine, like potassium, magnesium, sodium, etc., and found that they were unaffected by the treatment with zeolite, which backs up the other toxicological data showing no signs of toxicity. Now, this is the actual graph of the data here. And this was a group that was just given zeolite for 1 week. And we can see that for each of the metals, which are listed on the bottom, that is, I can't remember, is that arsenic, lead, mercury, tin, cadmium, and I can't remember what SB is right now. But nevertheless, you can see that the hollow rectangles represent day 0 before they got any zeolite, and the others represent day 1, 4, and 7. And you can see that on day 4, they had peak excretion in all cases except lead and mercury. But this shows that just by taking zeolite by mouth, the heavy metals that are already stored in your body start coming out in the urine. And it includes all these different metals, and including mercury, which is often said to be very particularly difficult to get rid of. So I think you can see that there's quite a significant amount of data supporting the use of zeolite. First, that it's extremely safe and non-toxic. Secondly, that it can bind and chelate quite a lot of harmful and toxic substances, and has been most excessively looked at for heavy metals. And it seems to be able to increase the excretion of almost all the toxic heavy metals that have been looked at as being relevant for human health. So I think we can take away that overall this is a very useful therapeutic natural substance, if it is prepared properly, of course, that it can be incorporated into many type of healing protocols and give really excellent results for a variety of conditions, including some that I didn't talk about too much today. So don't forget that at my shop, we sell a very reputable and ZeoHealth zeolite, which is the clinoptilolite micronized purified form that is used in much of this research, although there are many variations and varieties used, but I can definitely guarantee the quality of this product. So if you're planning to incorporate zeolite into your healing practices, please do take a look. All right, now I would be happy to take a few questions. I should have asked you to put some questions in the comments for me, but perhaps you can do that now. I'm just going to take a look and see what kind of questions. All right, so we have a question from Lenka. To stop bleeding with zeolite, is it to put the powder on bleeding or wound or internally? No, you want to put this right on the wound. And in the free masterclass that I mentioned about avoiding the emergency department, I give specific instructions, and actually there's a free PDF with the written instructions there. And if it's a small superficial wound, you can put some of the powder directly on the wound and apply some pressure in any way that's convenient. If we have a more serious wound, like an arterial bleed or a gunshot wound that is deep and has a lot of bleeding, you want to pack a whole bunch of it in there, and then you want to put packing material on top of that, and then a pressure bandage. And these things are all available in typical trauma emergency kits that you can buy online from many sources, and it can be used, instead of the other hemostatic bandages. You can, where it might be impregnated in gauze, you can just put the powder right on the wound. You can combine it also with the other hemostatics by putting the powder directly on the wound. It will not cause any internal problems if you do that. Okay. And I think we actually have the links in the comments. Thank you, Alexander or Scott, for putting those there. All right. Okay, we have a question about how often zeolite should be taken. Well, it should be used on a daily basis if you're going to use it for this purpose. Now, interestingly, the urinary excretion data that I showed you showed that after 14 days, the urinary excretion decreased substantially. So it might be good to do 14-day pulses. So like do 2 weeks on, 2 weeks off to maximize your heavy metal removal over time. It can also be used intermittently for example, an acute gastrointestinal illness like from food poisoning or something else. It could even be combined with certain foods to mitigate the contamination. Like, for example, if you were going to eat peanut butter, which might contain aflatoxin, if you took some zeolite with the meal, most likely it would bind the aflatoxin in the peanut butter and either reduce or eliminate your exposure. Okay, is there a difference between activated zeolite and just regular zeolite? Well, there are so many different ways to modify zeolites, and activated doesn't even mean one thing. In the literature I've seen, activated can mean heating, or it could mean mixing with alkaline materials. So there are many, many different ways to prepare this, which of course makes it very confusing as to what is the best product. I go with the natural product, so I prefer something that has only been processed to the degree of mechanical changes, like putting it into smaller particles that you can actually ingest, because it can be sometimes in big crystals in nature. But there also, I'm not aware of any studies that are looking at comparing all these different types of preparations for clinical purposes, although you can find them for industrial purposes. But many times the differences are theoretical. For example, they have different parameters, like the hole size would be one, which is, the size of the chelation binding site of the zeolite, and they can do a bunch of modifications of the natural zeolite to change that. But in some studies where they've tried to evaluate, does it make a difference, what they find is that all the varieties work. And if some of them work a little bit better than others for certain things, but they can't necessarily correlate it to those physical parameters, other studies, they might make claims that they can. So I think I would just go with the natural formulation, because my proclivity is that nature provides everything in the perfect form. Okay. Is your pulverized powder a nano size? No, it is a micro size, just as the materials used in the studies that I reviewed today. Let's see if we have one or two more questions. Thank you for the well wishes and the compliments, everyone. All right, here is a question. Should a person stop UT while taking zeolite for a period of time to avoid re-ingesting the stuff we're trying to get rid of? I'm not sure what UT is. All right, how much should one take at a time? Well, I have if you buy my product, in addition to the basic directions on the package, there is a code and a website that gives detailed information on dosing because it depends on the reason that you're taking. So a typical dose, let's say that you have, diarrhea that you want to treat, would be either 3 capsules or approximately 1 teaspoon or 5 grams of the powdered zeolite. And then that can be repeated, for an acute illness every hour up to, several doses. If you're taking it for, maintenance or for an acute protocol, there would be slightly different dosing regimens. So you can find all that out. It can be very difficult, by the way, to look at the studies and figure out the dosages because sometimes they use different ways of describing it, and it's not always exactly clear the exact amount of the substance. But we do know that it is safe up to extremely high amounts, even 10,000 milligrams per kilogram in livestock animals has shown no toxicity. All right, let's see if there's one more question here that. All right, here. Is zeolite superior to bentonite clay and charcoal for removing heavy metals? Well, there are some differences between them, but actually I often recommend using bentonite clay in conjunction with zeolite, but I use bentonite clay on the skin, either in the form of a bath or by making a paste out of it that you can use like a mask. And that's one of the things that really helped me with hair growth, for example. But zeolite, one thing about it is that it's shown not to absorb anything from your food in terms of nutrients or minerals. So it's very, very safe to take and proven to be very, very safe. It's possible that charcoal may absorb some nutrients out of the food. I haven't found specific data addressing that. Charcoal does bind some heavy metals, but not as broadly as zeolite, from what I can tell from the research. There are far fewer studies on bentonite clay, but there is some data, and it definitely is effective. Also at binding heavy metals, you'll find similar data. And let me mention my other favorite chelating substance, which is cilantro. And extracts or tinctures of cilantro have also shown incredible effectiveness at removing heavy metals and even reversing organ damage that occurred as a consequence of heavy metals. And of course, I also sell cilantro at my shop in a special form. And I was out of stock, but we just finished manufacturing a new batch, and it should be in stock within the next week or so, as soon as it arrives from the manufacturing facility. So I think that's all the time that I have for questions today. But I want to thank everyone for your participation, asking those questions. And I look forward to seeing you next week for another Healthy Living live stream.